All right, we're back with part two of this edition of James H. Cone's Black Theology and Black Power. So let's get into it. So we left off into chapter 4, which is titled The Black Church and Black Power. So um, he's talking about, so this is literally like a timeline of how the Black church was informed in the Black American context, and how it's is in today, and the type of and how liberation theology is possible within the Black church. And yeah, he said the Black church, it originated in during because of slavery, and it's it was pretty much a safe haven for a lot of for slaves, because you go through, it's literally like work, because you go through the job of being a slave, and who knows what happened during that week, and then you come to a place where you get community, and it give and not, a lot of the freedom songs and stuff like that, it came from the Black religious spaces during slavery. And a lot of spirituals came from that, like Go Down Moses is one of them. um Another one was I so glad trouble don't last always, and I know that other world is not like this. um like there's some freedom there's some a lot of history with those songs and spirituals. Oh freedom, oh freedom, oh freedom over me, and before I be a slave I be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. um yeah, like Wade in the Water, Roll Jordan Roll. I think said some of those songs in W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. So it talks about the history of those songs, and how it gave it's literally liberation work with music, like like singing songs about the struggle. It gives you consciousness, and know that um it helps you assert your humanness, and give them the freedom work that you can do in in that capacity, because like during the slavery period, there's so much power that people didn't have back then. And he was talking about the Black church before the Civil War. um he was talking about how before the Civil War, he was talking about the abolition movement. So a lot of slave revolts, and they were galvanized by the Black church. So so James Cone finds the pre-Civil War Black church to be more into the roots of liberation work than clearly post Civil War Black church. But he finds how useful it is to study that, because Nat Turner, if the slave revolt happened happened it wouldn't have happened, it wouldn't be as significant as it was if he um learned to read and write through reading the Bible and the stories that he learned in the Bible. And I think the story of Moses in Egypt, that helped mobilize and encourage him to fight for freedom. And he and then he saw that connected with Black Power. So he sees the Black Power message as a reconnection with the Black church to the Black community. So because it goes back into the roots of the abolition stance that black churches before the Civil War were encouraging. And he was talking about how a lot of these black churches existed because of the white churches didn't accept them. Like he literally said there are independent black churches today because black people refuse to accept the white master's view of the Christian faith. And and yeah, he talked about how Nat Turner was a Baptist preacher and not only urged rebellion against white slave owners, but became an ardent leader of the most successful slave revolts. And yeah, like I think the black church was like one of the first places where black people could get political and not be scrutinized for it. It's literally like their safe space. It's literally gives them a place of solace where they can be affirmed in their identity and in their blackness. And we need to go back to that. That's what he's saying. And Cone said it was the black preacher's unqualified identification with the black slave which created his doubts about God's existence. Similarly, it is understandable when many black power people shun the religion of Christianity and view God as meaningless in the black revolution. It may even be necessary in light of white prostitution of the faith, but the black preachers during slavery did not think it necessary. They were assured that God was alive and that he was working in history against the evils of slavery. So that pretty much helped enhance his black liberation theology of conceptualization. And he saw how the black church it doesn't only have to be a symbol for protest, but it can be a symbol of escapism from all the harms and the violence that they got from white supremacy. So that's pretty much the beauty of the beauty of that community can do when you have communion over and have a place where there's peace, where there's safety, and there's healing from the pain that white supremacy caused. And he talked about how let me see. Yeah, he said to look toward the future is to grasp the truth of God, and to grasp the truth of God is to become intolerant of untruth. And he also got into like how white supremacy distorted Christianity. He said the white missionaries sought to interpret hope in a way that made it unrelated to the present. They taught the slave that to hope means to look to heaven for a reward for being obedient to the master on earth. So he said like slave masters literally told slaves that if you obey my orders, you will get to heaven. Like I have the God in me. Literally, there's a God complex. Like I'm God, and you have to listen to me. And that's literally violence in itself, is creating like this domination submission dynamic. And Cone said, with this view, Christian hope not only cheats the slave of the meaning of the present, it cheats God, the present reality of God and his involvement in the world on behalf of man. As long as hope does not change the thought and action of men in the present, it is meaningless. And he talked about black preachers before the Civil War. He said they emphasized in word and deed the very point that is the concept of hope is central in the preaching of black ministers. They taught their people to look to the future, to visualize a new day, and the spirituals bear testimony to their concern for the future. And on the other hand, their concern for the future did not relieve them of the responsibility for the present. Instead, it enhanced it. So I was thinking about Adrienne Marie Brown's pleasure activism when she was talking about Octavia Butler and her love for science fiction and how it creates Afrofuturism, and how it gives you imagination on what we should strive for, what could happen, and what should we be striving for. And I think that you can, given putting it in a theological sense, it can grasp people that are in religious communities that understanding. And think that was it. So now he's going into the post Civil War Black church, in which Cone was dragging. Um, he said, like, because of these quote unquote signs of progress, Black preachers feel like freedom is, we're not in a place that we're not in centuries ago, but we can be a little passionate to whiteness, which is illogical in itself. So they adopt respectability politics, they adopt conservatism and stuff like that. Like, and also the Black minister has been like a political symbol in the Black community. So for people that are trying to get elected to office, their way to go to Black to reach out to Black communities, the Black church is a notable heavy figure when it comes to trying to get the Black vote, and understanding trying to understand Black issues. And Cone said the Black church thus lost its zeal for freedom in the midst of the new structures of white power. The rise of segregation and discrimination in the post-Civil War period softened its drive for equality. The Black minister remained a spokesman for the Black people, but faced by insurmountable obstacles, he succumbed to the cajolery and bribery of the white power structure and became its foil. The passion for freedom was replaced with innocuous homiles against drinking, dancing, and smoking, and injustices in the present were minimized in favor of a kingdom beyond this world. Black churches adopted, for the most part, the theology of the white missionaries and taught blacks to forget the present and look to the future. Some Black ministers even urged blacks to adopt the morality of white society entirely, suggesting that interest into the kingdom of heaven is dependent on obedience to the laws of white society. A jail sentence or a fine meant that a person was immoral. So that leads to carcerality, and how equating carcerality with immorality gives justification for white supremacy. And he also says, subject often to churchly probation and sometimes to expulsion. Other ministers said that suffering in his life was necessary for the next life. Undue concern about white injustice was thus a sign of a loss of faith, a failure to realize that patience and long suffering were more pertinent to final judgment than zeal for present justice. Seek first the kingdom of Christ, the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these other things will be added unto you. This meant endurance now, liberty later. So it's this messaging that some Black churches say, that you have to suffer, and you need to be humbled. Like, there needs to be some hazing or something. There needs to be a rite of passage that you have to go through to really get your ticket to heaven, as if you're God. And he also said a Black minister thus became a most devoted Uncle Tom. So there's Black preachers that are acting like the house slave. And next is so yeah, that's his take on that. He was also talking about the civil rights organizations. Even they strayed away from the representation of Black churches, and because there was so much corruption in Black churches. Like, there are arguments between the Southern Christian Leadership Council, because they have a religious background, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and other organizations during the Civil Rights Movement. And there were even Black preachers that critiqued Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy for freedom and stuff like that. So it shows you, like, Black people are not monolithic. There are different ideologies that go within them, even if it's complicated, even if it's harmful and violent. And Cone said, but the real sin of the black church and its leaders is that they even convinced themselves that they were doing the right thing by advocating obedience to white oppression as a means of entering at death the future age of heavenly bliss. The black church identified white words with God's word and convinced its people that by listening in faithful obedience to the great white father, they would surely enter the pearly gates. Thus, the creativity of the black church, which characterized the pre-Civil War period, is missing after the war. So he's pretty much saying that the post-Civil War black church has lost its touch with its roots. And it's literally a paradox with how it's supposed to be represented. And it's like it's lost its history. It's not going into abolition and refusal for white power structures, and it's going towards acceptance to whiteness, pretty much. So acceptance to things that are there because of colonialism, capitalism, and white supremacist heteropatriarchy. And he got into how Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Became insignificant because he's not like one of those. He's not one of those black preachers that preaches the word, but his action says another thing. He actually fought against the Antichrist, which is white supremacy. Like, you can tell, like, he was like he saw the United States as how James Cone saw it. Like, it's like Dr. King literally said the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence, and especially when he was speaking out against the war in Vietnam and poverty. So like he said, he saw him as he was literally living life like Jesus, because Jesus would have done the same thing. And Cone said that the black church needs to have a reckoning. There needs to be some civil disobedience training, and civil disobedience has to be connected with their theological praxis. So just like white people have to reckon with their whiteness, the black elite class and the black church needs to have a reckoning within themselves on how they've been contributing to the conditions that the black communities have to deal with. And he said the black church must ask about its function amid the rebellion of black people in America. Where does it stand? If it is to be relevant, it must no longer admonish its people to be nice to white society. It cannot condemn the rioters. It must make an unqualified identification with the looters and rioters, recognizing that this stance leads to condemnation by the state as lawbreakers. There is no place for nice Negroes who are so distorted by white values that they regard laws as more sacred than human life. There is no place for those who deplore black violence and overlook the daily violence of whites. There is no place for blacks who want to be safe, for Christ did not promise security but suffering. So he pretty much told the black church, like, post Civil War, like, you're not your ancestors. All right, so that's the end of chapter 4. So now we're on chapter 5, which is titled Some Perspectives of Black Theology. And the first one was about black suffering. So he said the task of black theology then is to analyze the black man's condition in the light of God's revelation in Jesus Christ, with the purpose of creating a new understanding of black dignity among black people and providing the necessary soul in that people to destroy white racism. Black theology is primarily a theology of and for black people who share their common belief that racism will be destroyed only when black people decide to say in word and deed to the white races, we ain't gonna stand any more of this. The purpose of black theology is to analyze the nature of the Christian faith in such a way that black people can say yes to blackness and no to whiteness and mean it. So that pretty much enhances understanding on why people should be attracted to black theology, because it focuses on black people's experiences and promotes their humanity and dignity. And The next was about on religious authority, in which he was talking about how you shouldn't let white supremacy be the standard of, you should not give them the power on what is Christian and what's not Christian. You should do the work within yourself. Even and it should, like how the black church needs to go back to how pre-civil war black church was tackling the system. Everyone needs to go back to how Jesus Christ was going against the system. So he said, it is within this larger context of the world that we are to understand Black theology and religious authority. The discussion of authority must depart from the abstract debate among fundamentalists, liberalists, and neo-orthodox thinkers, though there are expressions of these three major streams of Protestant thought within the Black churches. Black theology sees a prior authority that unites all Black people and transcends these theological differences. It is this common experience among Black people in America that Black theology elevates as a supreme test of truth. To put it simply, Black theology knows no authority more binding than the experience of oppression itself. This alone must be the ultimate authority in religious matters. So your experience on how you navigate oppression, what you need to do to dismantle oppression, let those be your religious authority, not the oppression itself. And he was talking about eschatology, where he has a definition for it. Yeah, he was talking about if eschatology means that one believes that God is totally uninvolved in the suffering of men because he is preparing them for another world, then Black theology is not eschatological. So it's pretty much the putting the theory and praxis, the pedagogy of theology and oppression. So it should connect God with people that are oppressed, the people that are suffering, the poor, and that's what Black theology is. And it gives a racial analysis to it, so it centers the most marginalized people. In this case, Black people, which are going through the most of violence and pretty much the bottom of the barrel, bottom of the totem pole. And if there's no eschatology on that, then there's no eschatology at all. It doesn't exist. And Cone said something that was very compelling. He said, the free Christian man cannot be concerned about a reward in heaven. Rather, he is a man who, through the freedom granted in Christ, is ready to plunge himself into the evils of the world, revolting against all inhuman powers that enslave men. He does not seek salvation, for he knows that to seek it is to lose it. He that would save his life will lose it. He who loses his life for my sake will gain it. He is a rebel against inhumanity and injustice. So eschatology is doing whatever it means necessary to make freedom exist, and not just to make you feel good, not just to get to heaven. Like you really have to do some soul searching, look at your actions. Are those things that that will truly get you to heaven, or are those things that are just making you feel good, and you think, just because I did this, that should be my ticket to heaven? So that gives a good perspective on how people should be practicing Christianity and practicing morality in general, and it doesn't have to be Christian. And he said, with a Black perspective, eschatology comes to mean joining the world and making it what it ought to be. It means that the Christian man looks to the future not for a reward or possible punishment of evildoers, but as a means of making him dissatisfied with the present. His only purpose for looking to a distant past or an unrealized future is that both disclose the ungodliness of the present. Looking to the future, he sees that present injustice cannot be tolerated. Black theology asserts an eschatology that confronts a world of racism with black power. So he's pretty much emphasizing how black power is can be viewed as the theology of revolution, and that's the revolution that the oppressed people need in order to get the human care that they need. And yeah, so eschatology does not mean merely salvation of the soul, individual rescue from the evil world, comfort for the troubled conscience, but also the realization of the eschatological hope of justice, the humanizing of man, the socializing of humanity, and peace for all creation. So it makes an so literally eschatology is pretty much another word for liberation in that sense. And he also talked about the creation of new values. He was talking about the differences between the mainstream church and churches that are underground. He was talking about churches that were underground that white people had to and these are the white people that actually practice Christianity with a liberation practice and thinks that's the place where white people should be congregating amongst themselves, and how do they battle white supremacy and stop anti-blackness from keep going. And the institutional church is a different story. They're fighting to keep oppressive systems. So so there needs to be a focus of the people. There needs to be accountability for white people on how they handle whiteness. And Cone said here, to be free means to be free to create new possibilities for existence, and those should be the goals for those spaces, the underground church and the black church that actually practice abolition theology. Yeah, you said black theology is a theology of the black community and is thus opposed to any idea that alienates it from that community. And sometimes the underground church might not recognize that because they're probably most focused on poverty, probably don't have the race analysis, but it's up to them to make sure they get they do the research and have the knowledge to combat white supremacy in all its shapes and forms. And that's struggle and coalition in itself, because they can build community with each other too. And he literally says revolution is the new displaces the old. So it believes in getting rid of a system that doesn't serve you, of yeah. So he finishes off with we took on false identities that destroyed our real selves, our beautiful black selves. The new order, partially realized now but now fully consummated, is an order that affirms black self-identity. And that's it for that chapter. So the next chapter is actually the last chapter. I think I said on the last video that there's a chapter 7, but it's just 6 chapters. So the last chapter, chapter 6, is titled Revolution, Violence, and Reconciliation in Black Theology. So he's pretty much saying that there needs to be a focus on revolution rather than protest. Like, protesting is essential to revolution, but it can't be the only thing that's happening. He said, protest merely calls attention to justice. It is an act of defiance against what is conceived to be an established evil. It is the refusal to be silent in the presence of wrong to which others are accommodated. And but there needs to be a protest and not just marching in the streets, but also in like education, and also in community engagement, also in music, whenever it's making anything that's related to oppression not exist. And he said, in contrast, revolution sees every particular wrong as one more instance in a pattern which is itself beyond rectification. Revolution aims at the substitution of a new system for one adjudged to be corrupt rather than corrective adjustments within the existing system. The power of revolution is coercive. So he told how the pre-Civil War Black preachers were revolutionary. So look to them for liberation study. And revolution it has to be a collective thing, and it can be, like, because people have different politics, whatever it looks like, but there needs to be an agreement. There needs to be some education, some accountability, some understanding that will get people to revolution. And whatever long it takes to get that revolution is what people should focus on. And the next part was violence. So pretty much talking about how white Christians tend to look at violence as antichrist, when Christ literally went through violence. So you're saying that we should be crucified ourselves. So, like, Christ is a human being, first of all, but we can learn a lot on how his existence can teach us to be the liberators that we need to be. And it has to be anti-state violence. So whether that's however that looks like, it's up to us. He said, we must realize that to carve out a theology of Black revolution that does not sidestep the question of violence is difficult. It is normal with the Western view of morality to think that any expression of violence, at least by the disfranchised, is unchristian. By contrast, it is quite normal to think that a nation has a right to defend its national interests with violence, especially if it happens to be a part of the free world. It is interesting that so many advocates of nonviolence as the only possible Christian response to Black people to white domination are also the most ardent defenders of the right of the police to put down Black rebellion through violence. Another interesting corollary in their defense of America's right to defend violently the government of South Vietnam against the North. Somehow I am unable to follow the reasoning. So he was pretty much, how y'all talking about nonviolence and you're literally causing violence in another country. So that's that on that. Yeah, he said, but violence can be tricky if it's for safety reasons. He said, each situation has its own problematic circumstances that force the believer to think through each act of obedience without an absolute ethical guide from Jesus. To look for such a guide is to deny the freedom of the Christian man. Because, like, if we go through by, like, an ethical guide, it's literally like, so, like, everyone has to follow this rule, all these rules. Like, people have different personalities on how they're going to reach the revolution and liberation. Like, it's not going to be, there shouldn't be, like, some rules that dictate how what's considered ethics or what's considered moral. So it is pretty much challenging the notion that it only can be nonviolent. Like, nonviolent is good, and nonviolent isn't always good. And he also said, to be Christian means that one is concerned not about good and evil in the abstract, but about men who are lynched, beaten, and denied the basic needs of life. It is not enough to know that Black people make up a high percentage of the poor, that white complacency forces them to live in rat-infested apartments, that despite the gains of civil rights laws, police brutality is on the increase, that the appeal to love and nonviolence is a technique of the rich to keep the poor poor. These facts must be translated into human beings. And if James Cone is saying this in 1969, I think, like decades ago, and police violence is still increased. Like there's probably more police violence now than in the 60s. So it tells you about what is policing, what's the institution of policing for, and how abolition still needs to be in conversations about in community circles and grassroots organizing spaces where it's focuses on dismantling oppression. And he also challenged a nonviolent on this quote. If he decides to take the nonviolent way, then he is saying that revolutionary violence is more detrimental to man in the long run than systemic violence. But if the system is evil, then revolutionary violence is both justified and necessary. Case in point, like you're gonna be a hypocrite if you're saying like I should take in all this violence and not fight back. So tells you about the importance of self-determination and self-defense too. And then he talked about this next part is talk about reconciliation, and this is specifically reconciliation for white religious people on how they should continue their existence of preaching the gospel of Christ, and how they should be practicing theology. So like James Cone is literally giving white religious people some steps on what they should be doing with their power, and what they should be doing with to eliminate whiteness. And Cone said white oppressors are incompetent to dictate the terms of reconciliation because they are enslaved by their own racism and will inevitably seek to base the terms on their right to play God in human relationships. The history of slavery and Jim Crow and integration efforts renders white people virtually incapable of knowing even how to talk to black people as persons. It is this fact that nullifies the good intentions of concerned white religious people who insist that they are prepared to relate to black people as human beings. They simply do not know how. Since racism is inseparable from the history of America, and since practically all white people in this country are taught from birth to treat blacks as things, Black theology must counsel black people to be suspicious of all whites who want to be friends with black people. Therefore, the real question is not whether black theology see reconciliation as an end, but rather on whose terms we are to be reconciled. So we can't have reconciliation with white people on white people's standards. It has to come from black people's standards, the oppressed people's standards. What do we need to get taken care of? What do we need to have survival? What do we need to take care of, not just ourselves, but our families and our community members? And yeah, Cone also said, fairness is a thing no white man has a right to ask of colored. I mean, look, who's been unfair to whom? Who's been unfair to my mother and her mother and my father and his father, and who will be unfair to my son and his children? Fairness is a word that should choke in a white man's throat. I'm not asking any white man to be fair with Solly Saunders, baby. I live with no such false illusions. And he also said, when we reanalyze the black-white relationship in the 20th century in the light of God's reconciling work in Jesus Christ, the message is clear. For black people, it means that God has reconciled us to an acceptance of our blackness. If the death, resurrection of Christ means anything, it means that the blackness of black people is a creation of God himself. God came into the world in order that black people need not be ashamed of who they are. In Christ, we not only know who we are, but who God is. This is the heart of the biblical message. God has created man in such a way that man's humanity is inseparable from divine fellowship. And these are the last quotes that I underline. Cone said, the coming of Christ means a denial of what we thought we were. It means destroying the white devil in us And the problem of values is not that white people need to instill values in the ghetto, but white society itself needs values so that it will no longer need a ghetto. So white people need to not just not just to interact with black people, but to create macro level change or something that's meaningful work to liberation practice. And he also said that he he also talked about black not as an identity, but black as a politic, and white people need to do this. And Cone said to be black means that your heart, your soul, your mind, and your body are where the dispossessed are. So you see the black experience, the most violent history that you see, and you have to look within yourself on what you can do to not create more damage and create the healing and the 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 sufficiency that black communities need when they face when they face violence, not just historically but in contemporary times. So yeah, that's it on James H. Cone's Black Theology and Black Power. So yep, that's it. All right. I know that was a lot, but it's tells you like it, it gives you like how even in theology and religious and Christianity messaging, like you can still live your life in a revolutionary spirit, and I got that from James H. Cone. And even though it's like it's kind of it, even though there was some, it's not like going into like decolonization all the way. Like there's some critiques, like there's no like an internationalist view into it, except the fact that he was talking about Vietnam, but talk about like what Africa is going through, what Palestine was going through. Even though you don't have an analysis of those type of issues, whether it's gender and sexuality, also you can still learn a lot from Black Theology and Black Power, because it literally gives you a focus on how you can be a child of God and practice liberation and the fight for freedom. And yep, that's it. So thank y'all for joining me in this conversation about liberation theology. It's the first book I got to discuss for liberation theology. I got some more books that focus on that, because I find that to be so cool. And yeah, stay tuned for another video maybe next week of and I'll tell you what the book is for the week. And I'm kind of excited on also the other books that delve into liberation theology. So y'all take care, and happy Valentine's Day. Yesterday was happy Black Love Day. So pretty much centering a type of love on a society that hates y'all. So that's something that needs to be celebrated and affirmed also. So thank y'all for joining me in this conversation, and see y'all later. Make sure y'all follow my reading list at Raisin Souls and my personal Instagram at Intellectual Albert, which will be on the description box below. And y'all have a great day. All right. Bye.